Okay, well, we pull up the slides. I'll go ahead and get started. I'm excited to be here today talking with you a little bit about the changing nature of work. What I'm going to do is talk about a few projects that we've got going on, research projects in the Center for Work, Technology, and Organization. I'm going to start, though, with a quote from the World Economic Forum. They have argued that we are now in the midst of a fourth industrial revolution. There's some debate about whether or not that's true, but I think everybody is pretty clear on the fact that we're seeing just a high velocity of change in the kinds of technologies that are available to people. And in particular, they're articulating changes in this fusion of technology that's beginning to blur the boundaries between the physical, digital, and biological spheres. What I'm going to talk about is the changing nature of work, and in particular, in WTO, we're concerned about how work is changing. We are not paying as much attention to, it's just not our expertise to look at whether or not jobs will still be available. A lot of economists are looking at that. But we're concerned with how advances in, for example, data analytics, in robotics, particularly when we're talking about more autonomous robots. 3D printing, especially when that's moving more into a world where 3D printing is going to be a manufacturing process. Complex communication platforms that allow all kinds of contributions, particularly from outside the boundaries of an organization. How all of these things are changing what people do in their work, how people work with and collaborate with one another, what jobs are, how people think about themselves as professionals, what the professions are in which people are working, and what a career looks like. As more and more people are contributing from outside the boundaries of the organization, we may not have careers that look anything like what most of us have been accustomed to. So I'm going to talk specifically about a few different projects that are going on in the center, to just give you a sense of what we're working on, and then I'll dive a little bit more deeply into one project that I and a team are working on. So the first one, this is being led by a first-year PhD student, Ayanween Muma. And she, for about the last month, has been spending time in a company that has 3D printing and is looking at 3D printing as the wave of manufacturing for the future. And in particular, she is observing the mechanical engineers and the product designers and trying to understand how their job, what they do, how they think about their work is different than it has been in the past, and still is in many places today. When you, for example, are now able to prototype on your means of production rather than having to prototype outside of that means of production. When you no longer have to worry too much about tooling and huge investments in tooling. When you can do much more rapid changes and customization in that process. It's very, very early stage for that, but one of the things that we're beginning to see is a much, much heavier demand for interdisciplinary kinds of collaboration on the very front end of this process. Another project is being run by Ryan Lusvardi, another first-year PhD student, and she is working, also doing field research embedded within a firm, and is concerned about how data analytics are actually being enacted in an organizational context. Accenture recently did a survey, and they concluded that at least 60% of decisions that are now made in organizations are being made based on data analytic output of some kind. And what she wants to know is, well, what does this process look like? How is decision making being changed? What is the data that people are actually drawing on? How are they making sense of that data? How are they then interpreting and presenting that data to decision makers? What are decision makers doing with it? How do people think about the decisions that they're making? Again, this is also very early stage, but one of the things that's quite interesting, particularly given what Ron was talking about, is people are increasingly talking about truth. Once they have data, they have truth. without really thinking about the fact that it's all probabilities.
You mean truthiness, right?
Truthiness, right. We have truthiness now. So that, I think, is going to be a really interesting space as that expands, the use of data analytics expands. Melissa Valentine, one of the newer professors in our department and in the center, has been looking at online labor markets. How many people have used an online labor market like Upwork, or a handful of people in the room? So basically, an online labor market allows you to go online on an online platform. So let's say, for example, I want to redesign my slides. I could post this job on an online labor market and say, I need somebody to do this. I would then get quotes from a whole host of people, probably from all around the world. I would choose somebody. We would then communicate through this platform. Ultimately, they would deliver what it is I've requested, and I would approve it through that platform, and then they would be paid through the platform. What Melissa's looking at is how can we support more complex kinds of project work in these platforms. Typically, what we've seen is like through Mechanical Turk and other crowdsourcing environments, we have what are called micro tasks. So very small, independent tasks that can then be aggregated. But she and her colleague, Michael Bernstein in computer science, and some PhD students wanted to know, well, what if we want to build an app? What if we want to produce a video and we need a whole bunch of different people and they're interdependent upon one another and they all have to work concurrently? So what they've done is built a platform called Foundry, and they've tested this out and have been able to ramp up sort of medium-sized, what they call flash organizations that have between like 30 and 37 employees. They were able to, these organizations that they tested out were able to hire employees in an average of 14 minutes. And accomplish really complex tasks in a relatively short period of time. Another student, second-year PhD student, Katerina Lix, is working, she's studying Gigster, which is also an online labor market, where you can have software development projects developed. And she's really interested in trying to understand how gigs get coordinated and what leads to more effective gigs and what it means to have an effective gig in that environment. A gig is a project. And then this one I'll talk a little bit more about. This is a project that I and a team are working on, looking at open innovation environments, and I'll define that in just a minute. And we're concerned or interested in what collaboration looks like in these open innovation environments and how you coordinate them so that you get more innovation and more ideas submitted. So what is open innovation? Open innovation is when a company says, we have a really complex problem, like with NASA, or we have a design challenge that for some reason we need outside input on. So what they do is they post these problems or these challenges in an online platform, and they invite people to contribute. Unlike an online labor market, generally these are competitions. And generally, you only get paid if you win the competition. It's a little different setting, although a lot of similarities to online labor markets. Oh, and I wanted to say that we recently received funding from the National Science Foundation to continue with this work. So we're studying a company called Local Motors. Local Motors is kind of a small, boutique-y vehicle manufacturing company. From their inception, they have sourced virtually all of their conceptual design ideas for their new vehicles from an online platform using Open Innovation, an online platform that they developed. They have 2-week to 2-month-long competitions where they develop a design brief, put it out there, and then evaluate the ideas that come back. Their platform has around 100,000 engineers, car enthusiasts, designers, and so forth. And they're material scientists now. They're really increasing the breadth of the type of people that are on this platform. We've started by looking at one of their relatively small competitions. This is called Project Redacted, where they wanted somebody to design a 3D printed car. They have now printed that car. It's called the Strati. It's a little fragile, but they've done it. I would not drive it more than 20 miles an hour. There were 116 participants in this challenge, and 62 people submitted actual design ideas that were then evaluated by the company. What we've done is we've scraped all of the data for this competition. We've taken all of the posts that people, where people were talking about their design ideas or this competition. We've gone through and read and coded every single one of these interactions in order to understand what was actually happening between people. How were they coordinating? What were they talking about? And in a very kind of a gross distinction, we're looking at, were they talking about the task? Were they giving each other feedback on their designs and so forth? Or was it more encouragement, support, more affective kind of feedback? And then we extracted the interaction matrices of who was talking with whom. So these findings are really preliminary. This is, we've been working on the project a while, getting all the data together, but we have a lot more analysis to do. What we did find is that relatively more ties with companies, so local motors representatives on the platform. When people were talking with the company representatives, they were much more likely to submit their ideas in the end. So that's a good thing for the company. They want more and more ideas. However, the quality of those ideas, the innovation in those ideas went down if they were talking relatively more with the company. And what we think is going on there is that by talking a lot more with company representatives, all those people were talking with the same folks. So they weren't getting a lot of variety of input. They were feeling really confident because they were talking, they were confident in their ideas because they were talking with company representatives. They felt encouraged, they felt part of the community, but they just weren't getting the variety of input. If the contributors had affective ties, so they got kind of emotional support from local motors first and then got feedback, it increased the likelihood that they would submit. So that suggests that developing that foundation in the platform is useful. Then we looked at competitors, so the extent to which their competitors were, or their interaction was relatively higher with competitors, other people who are likely to submit ideas on the platform. And what we found was exactly the opposite. So the more they interacted with competitors, the less likely they were to submit their ideas. And a couple of different things could be going on here. One is that it may have been just an awareness of the competitive landscape. They saw what other people were doing, got feedback from people and said, maybe my idea is not really worth developing. They may have just felt like it was a more competitive environment and therefore they didn't enjoy participating as much. But in this case, the novelty of what they submitted increased if they were interacting more with competition. A couple different things could be going on there. One is it could be that they're getting better input from this broader variety of people. It may also be that the bad ideas were discouraged. Early on, they didn't submit them, so we just have a smaller subset. The more affective ties with competitors actually strengthen the negative effect of submitting, which was, we're still trying to sort out what was going on there. So what we're going to do next is we have a lot more analysis. We want to evaluate the underlying explanations of what it is that was actually happening. So I said, well, maybe it's that people weren't interacting with as many people, getting as many good ideas. Maybe they felt discouraged. We're actually able to look more closely at the data, the content of the data, and figure out exactly what explains the effects that we're looking at. And then we're going to use a technique, or we are using a technique called relational event modeling, so that we can look more at the temporal dynamics. Like how do the relationships actually develop over time, and how do those profiles lead to better ideas that are submitted. We're also working on more challenges. So we've got the Airbus challenge, and I forgot to mention that earlier. This is actually the Airbus challenge. Airbus is partnered with them, and what they wanted to do is get ideas for a cargo drone that could carry humanitarian aid into inaccessible areas. So that's the Airbus challenge that we're looking at. In that case, it's much larger. There's going to be much more data, so we'll be able to better test some of our hypotheses. And then we also want to look at co-design patterns where people are giving each other a lot of feedback. One of the ideas of an open innovation platform is you get a lot of smart people together and they work together and fuel one another's ideas. So we want to see, well, is that actually happening in this environment, and is there a good effect at the end? All right, so just to wrap up, I hope I have convinced you that the Center for Work, Technology, and Organization is at the forefront of looking at how technology advances are changing the nature of work. In particular, how people relate to and coordinate their work with each other, how people feel about their professions, how professions are evolving, also how decisions will be made, interpreted, understood, who's involved in making those decisions, on what basis, what a career ends up looking like. If we're talking about open innovation, online labor markets, increasingly people are working from outside the boundaries of the firm, and there are real questions about, well, what does that mean for people's career? For the students who are graduating now, what is their career going to look like? And then more generally, what are the skills that are necessary for people to be successful in the 21st century as work evolves in all these ways. So with that, I'll wrap it up and turn it over to Tina Seelig.